Hello everybody, welcome back for another photography training session together with Joburg Photowalkers. Hope everybody's keeping warm. Actually quite a nice day today. What's everybody been up to? You're welcome to put something in the comments there. We're going to get started in a second. We're just seeing that I'm just seeing more people join right now. But ready to start. Today we're going to be looking at 5 photography myths and misconceptions, especially with digital photography. So we'll focus on a few things that that's not really applicable and that you shouldn't listen to that much. But we'll get started with that in 1 second. Before that, you know the drill by now. I'm going to share a couple of links for all the new people. If it's your first time joining and you're not part of Joburg Photowalkers, the question would be why not? I'm going to share the meetup link so you can join the meetup group. That's where all the photo walks are scheduled. So you'll be able to book your spot there for a photo walk. It's in the chat right now. So that's the meetup group. Just join the group and you'll get notifications if you've got the app on your phone. It will notify you when new walks are scheduled. So that's definitely worth looking at. Then Joburg Photowalkers also has a WhatsApp group, really nice group of people, and you can join the chat there. So this is the WhatsApp chat for Joburg Photowalkers. Then for this training specifically, we've got another WhatsApp group. I'm going to be sharing that one now. So if you've got any photography related questions, whether it's camera related, gear related, editing related, anything that you want to ask, this second WhatsApp group is the one to ask any photography related questions. Okay. And then lastly, we've got a mailing list. It's just a normal MailChimp mailing list, and the link for this training every week goes out to this email list. So you'll get a nice reminder in your inbox once a week about the training, and the link to join the training, this YouTube live training, will also be in this email. Good. So this is the last link. Great. Then we're just about to get started. Thank you for joining again. If you joined late, thanks, appreciate it. And yeah, that's all the admin out of the way. Please feel free to join any of these groups. They're definitely worth it, especially the Joburg Photowalkers groups. Nice and active photography community in Joburg. Good. Before we start with our presentation for tonight about the myths and misconceptions about digital photography, I've just got a quick update. In the last week, Adobe Lightroom had quite a major update, one of the largest updates we've seen in quite a long time. A lot of new features, and because we previously in this series covered a lot of features in Lightroom and did a lot of Lightroom training, I just want to quickly mention a couple of changes now, because it might impact anybody going back and watching some of those Lightroom training videos. So we're just going to take 2 minutes and look at this update, and then we'll get started with tonight's presentation. Let me share my iPad here. There we go. So this is the Adobe blog. This is all about the latest update. Most of these updates would impact all the Lightroom versions, and but especially some of these updates are specifically targeted to the Lightroom mobile version, or the Lightroom the iCloud version, the CC, previously called CC. So not specifically for classic. Some of these updates are classic also, but pretty much all these updates would be available in the new one. So I see somebody is saying they're battling with a connection. On my side, everything is looking good. Connection is looking healthy. I can't see anything on my side. You know, you might need to check your side. Could be a Wi-Fi or connection issue there. Good luck with that. With the load shedding and things currently, it's a constant battle with the internet. So this is the Adobe blog. So the first update, and as you can see, there's quite a lot of new things that they built into Lightroom. The very first thing is they've put more support for video into Lightroom. Previously, we could import videos into Lightroom and play them inside of Lightroom, catalog them in our Lightroom cataloging system. But unfortunately, we couldn't do any editing on these videos. We had to use some of the other Adobe products for editing. Right now, Lightroom will allow you to import video and also edit those video clips. It's not a full-featured editor where you can put different clips together, but what you can do is you can trim a video, so the start and the end, and you can also apply any of the normal Lightroom tools to your video clips. So you can now apply presets, you can do all the adjustments that you could previously only do to photos. You can now also apply those to video clips, which is quite handy, changing the look, highlights, shadows, contrast, all these handy little things, exposure. I still need to go through all these new features step by step and just see what exactly is in there. But having all our photo editing features available to also edit short video clips is actually quite nice. Color grading sort of things, presets, that's quite nice. So now we can edit videos and we can use all our familiar Lightroom tools. So that's new. The next thing that they've put in is the presets now have a little slider where you can dial it back or more. So if you find a preset or you've created your own preset, and we've covered this in a previous session. So if you created your own preset or you're using a different preset and you like the look, but it's a little bit too much, you can now grab the slider and just tone it down a bit. So it will apply less of that preset. So you get the look, but you don't have to completely apply it. You can dial it back a bit. So that's quite handy. I think that's a nice new update. You can dial your presets up and down with a little slider. Then there's new adaptive presets. So this is in conjunction with the artificial intelligence that Lightroom has been expanding lately. Every couple of updates, there's new artificial intelligence things built into Lightroom now. And now what they've done is they've also applied some of these artificial intelligence things that we previously saw in masking also to presets. So it's sort of smart presets where the preset might only do something to the sky or mostly to the sky, or it might try and find the subject and only apply this smart preset to the subject. And you can see some like dramatic skies and sort of things. It's just a preset you apply, but it will not apply to your whole image. It will just apply to specific areas, like in this case, either the sky or the subject. So you can warm up your subject, you can cool down your subject, you can make your clouds more dramatic, all these sort of things. And it's so it's artificial intelligence driven presets that's now built in. They've included some new premium presets. You can play around with those if you want. We've got red eye removal. I don't know why only now, but we've actually got red eye removal now. So there's a new tool. You don't have to do some of the workarounds we previously did, and together with our normal healing and cloning tool inside of the new Lightroom, we've now got red eye. So one-click red eye removal, which is quite nice. We've got a new comparison view. So now in the new Lightroom, similar to what's found in Lightroom Classic, we can have two images next to each other, compare the two images and decide which one we like better. So that's quite a handy tool. It was missing from the new Lightroom for quite a while, and I definitely missed it moving from Classic to the new one. Now we've got it, so that's quite nice. There's some community features where you can see how other people are editing. You can use some styles of other people that other people use. So you can share your edits of images and people can apply that to their own images, or that you can follow along with community edits and see how people got to a specific look. So you can sort of browse through different images and then see what people did. So that's I think that's quite nice. Some of that was already there. They've expanded a bit on that. You can now for the first time apply those edits that you see in somebody else's images that they shared actually to your own images, which is quite nice. And then one that's quite exciting, we previously did masking and we used the AI to select sky or to select subject in one of the previous videos. You can go back to the masking one. What we previously had to do when we copied these edits, including the masks to other images in a series, we had to go into the masking and click update for the AI to then find the sky again in the new image or find the subject again in the new image. Now it's automatic. So if you are using the AI masks, select subject or select sky, and you copy those masks over to multiple images, it will automatically update without you having to go and press that button. This is going to save quite a bit of time, quite nice. The masking on inverting masks you can now do on the specific masks and also on the whole group. So previously in the masking video, you saw me, I wanted to do that now to recreate one mask. Now it's built in, so you can invert your selection even if it's a whole group, which is quite nice. There's some new forward back buttons, similar to what a browser would have to navigate through things. And there's some better local storage management so you can decide how much hard drive space you allocate to Lightroom, and also clearing the cache, the local cache, to free up some space on your hard drive. And then they've improved the export performance, so faster exporting because it's using your graphics processor in your computer now. So I think these are really good updates, and some of them, especially in my workflow, will make a really good difference and speed up my editing. So I hope that helps. And like I said, some of the things we previously did also now makes quite a bit easier, especially on the masking side and on the preset side. You can go and watch those videos again and just remember that they've now updated some of those features. Good stuff. We will get started with the presentation. Give me 1 second and I will start my presentation here. Good. Let's get it going. Perfect. There we go. Okay, so the presentation for this evening, we're going to get started with it. It's all about 5 photography myths and misconceptions. So just something that people get wrong when it comes to photography, especially digital photography. And I just want to slightly move my screen around here. I see it's cutting off the tiniest bit. Give me 1 second. I will just move it in. There we go. Looking better. Okay, great. So let's start off with the presentation. First question is why? Why have we got these myths and misconceptions? How did they start? And we have to go back to a bit of the history. So the history of photography, obviously, before digital photography, it was film photography, mostly 35mm film photography, although some people used to use medium format as well. And what we saw is in that transition from film photography over to digital photography, especially in the first few years when there were quite a few limitations that digital cameras had, being brand new, being new things, they had some things that they couldn't get right, and that film still did better. And in those first few years, there's quite a few things that people told new digital photographers how to use these new cameras, how to use the settings, and some of those things stuck even over the last 15 years when digital cameras have become really good. The technology has advanced a lot, and a lot of these things that people used to tell new photographers are actually not true anymore. So we need to just have a quick look at where they come from and why people were told these things. Okay. So, like I said, a lot of these things started in that transition from film to digital cameras, and a lot of these concepts are actually outdated and not true anymore. Okay. So let's move on. The very first one. So our first myth or first misconception is a lot of people say you're not a real photographer if you're not shooting raw. I often hear people say, oh, somebody told me I need to shoot raw. The first thing I need to do is switch my camera over to raw. Now, we know there's quite a lot of good things that comes with shooting raw. I like Lightroom. I like editing a lot. I will spend quite a bit of time looking at Lightroom and all the different tools we've got, and in some cases it definitely helps starting with the RAW. Also, when you're making mistakes with things like exposure, your chances of recovering a usable image is actually better if you shot RAW. But there's many advantages to shooting JPEG as well, and we shouldn't forget these. For many years when I started off with digital photography, I just had JPEG. Most cameras in the early years only had JPEG. There was no RAW options. And this is one that I sort of forgot. For 10 plus years, I've only been shooting in RAW. I've been editing every single thing that I shot on my digital camera. And one of the things that I've noticed myself is doing some family trips or going out with the family, I would take out my phone rather than my camera, because in the back of my head I had this idea of, if I use my camera, I'm going to be sitting in Lightroom and editing these things, and it's just family moments that I want to capture, and my phone will do perfectly good job. But what I realized is my camera can do the exact and better job than what my phone can do. I've got some extra controls there, I've got a bigger sensor there, I've got a nice lens there. So why don't I just switch my camera to JPEG and capture all these things even better than what my phone can do, and I don't have to edit them. So that's one thing that I sort of realized is, and I've seen photographers do this. They're out and about, they're doing something fun, and they've got their camera, but they would take out their phone and take the image because they trust the phone to firstly expose correctly, and secondly, it's just the process is easier. The JPEG's there, it's done, they can share it with family members, they can do whatever they want with the JPEG. They don't need to go in and import stuff and edit stuff and do all sorts of other things. The nice thing with modern digital cameras is most of these camera brands have got an app that you can put on your phone. If you're shooting JPEG, you can just connect your camera to your phone, import it to your phone, and you can share it with family, friends. You can share it to social media. You can do whatever you need. You don't ever have to go into places like Lightroom. It can go straight. You can shoot JPEG. It can go straight to your phone, and it's just as if you shot that image with your phone, except you might have a nicer image, a nicer quality image. So that's one thing. The other thing is, a lot of people talk about the extra dynamic range you get with a RAW image versus a JPEG image, and that's true. You get extra dynamic range when you're shooting RAW. So there's more detail in the shadows, there's more detail in the highlights, and a JPEG, there's less of that. But the one thing is, many years ago when we started shooting RAW, that was a real limitation of the cameras. In the last 5 or 10 years, pretty much all the brands have built-in ways of reducing the dynamic range before saving the JPEG. So if you use Nikon, for instance, they've got active D lighting, they call it. Canon, I think, calls it something like automatic lighting. Fujifilm, they've got DR100, DR200, DR400, and auto DR, so it's just adjusting the dynamic range. What other brands? Olympus and Panasonic, you can adjust the tone curves, so you can drop the increase the shadows and drop the highlights. You can adjust these things in most new cameras. So basically, the one reason a lot of people are shooting RAW is they're importing that RAW image into Lightroom. They're lifting the shadows to get some detail in the shadows. They're dropping the highlights, so they're darkening the highlights to get some detail, mostly in the clouds and in the sky, in the highlight areas. And then they're saving the JPEG anyway from there. So they're basically just compressing that dynamic range from where the RAW was to where the JPEG one is, and that's what they're delivering to the client. Because or they're sharing to Instagram or to Facebook or with a family member, or that's what they're printing to do the canvas on the wall. All these end results generally come from a JPEG. The RAW is just a step in between. Now, if you adjust your highlights and shadows, or your dynamic range, or how your camera does it in camera, and all the new cameras can do that, you're basically doing the same thing. You're getting more detail in the shadows, more detail in the highlights as you decrease them, and it's saving the JPEG, but it's, instead of you doing it in Lightroom, the camera is doing it internally. So because we've got these features, the reasons for shooting RAW are becoming less and less. And then the other thing is, A lot of the new cameras have got some form simulations and some nice color profiles and things that you can apply straight into the JPEG. You can do monochrome, all these sort of things, and get the end result immediately without having to go to your laptop or computer or other editing device. So that's quite nice. Another thing is if you're doing sport or wildlife, you can save images faster. So your continuous shutter firing will be faster if you're saving JPEGs because they're smaller. You can have more images before the buffer on your camera fills up. So it just means you can shoot a lot faster if you're doing JPEGs instead of raw images. Okay, and a lot of sport photographers, especially professional sport photographers, would actually shoot JPEG for two reasons. One, the camera reacts faster when you're shooting JPEG. Two, they can actually just copy those JPEGs and deliver it to a client immediately during the game or after the game, whatever is happening when they're doing sport. Okay, then when you're thinking about JPEGs and the compression and the dynamic range, just always also think that whatever the end result is, what you're delivering to your client, what you're posting on Instagram, wherever it's going to be a JPEG anyway. So either your camera develops this JPEG based on the settings you set, or you go through something like Lightroom and you're developing that JPEG, but the end result's going to be that JPEG anyway. So the RAW just gives us some more control afterwards, where if you're shooting JPEG, you have to be careful with the settings in the camera prior to actually pressing the button. Things like white balance and things, you have to get right in camera versus doing it in Lightroom afterwards. But I definitely think shooting JPEGs can simplify the process, speed up the process, and also if you don't want to go and sit and edit for hours, just shooting JPEGs is very often a nice way of doing photography. Okay, so yeah, if you want to spend less time in Lightroom, definitely think about JPEGs. And just one last thing on JPEGs, don't think that you can't edit a JPEG. If you do want to edit a JPEG in Lightroom, all the tools are there. You can still edit JPEGs in Lightroom. You might have a little bit less leeway when you're doing big shifts in things like exposure, or big shifts in correcting white balance if you got it completely wrong. There it might not be as good as editing a RAW, but in most cases, shooting JPEG, you can still edit them in Lightroom perfectly fine. I was thinking about this for quite some time, and for the first time in many years, probably more than 10, this week I did a professional photo shoot and I shot JPEGs in camera, and I did a slight adjustment afterwards in Lightroom, and I delivered those images, and nobody would know that I didn't shoot RAW for that photo shoot, because the end results are exactly what I would expect and the perfect quality as I was doing previously based on RAWs, except I spent probably less than 1/10 of the time that I normally would spend editing. I edited on this because it was one slight adjustment and I could copy it to all the images, and it was done, where normally editing from RAW takes quite a bit more time. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. People are saying shoot RAW, but there's definitely a case to be made for JPEGs as well. Don't forget about them. Oh, just on that previous slide, this was a JPEG, just so that you know. There's plenty of detail. It's a really nice high resolution image. There's plenty of contrast. There's plenty of detail in the shadows. There's plenty of detail in the highlight areas. There weren't clouds, so we won't see those. But for my standards, looking at these images, there's very little difference in the final end result between shooting RAW or JPEG in most cases. The only real place where RAW can sometimes save you is if you practically make a mistake in your exposure or white balance. Okay, good. Next one. People say use manual mode. This is one that I've had a few discussions in the last weeks with some photographers about. There's a lot of photographers, a lot of people saying you need to be shooting manual mode. That's the way to do photography. If you're a real photographer, you'll shoot manual mode. I differ quite a bit on this. So the modern cameras are really good in their automatic modes as well. And if you're one of those people that, again, when something's happening, when the kids are playing and you need to capture the moment, if you're taking out your cell phone and not picking up your camera that's lying right there, you're probably worried about missing the moment or getting the settings wrong. And it shouldn't be like that. All the fancy exposure measuring and things that your cell phone can do, your camera can also do. Why do we trust our cell phones to get the exposure right and just press a button, but we don't trust our cameras to do the exact same thing? We've got this concept, and people have been telling us this for many years, where we need to do manual exposure, have full control of what we're doing, don't trust the camera to do it for us, but we'll take our phone out and we'll completely trust the phone to do a good job of those exact same things. So I want to tell you, trust your camera. These manufacturers have put in countless hours and thousands of hours and a lot of money into making the auto exposure modes a lot better. So whether you are using things like shutter priority modes or time value, or if you're using aperture priority modes or program auto or full auto, the manufacturers over the last years have come a long way in making these things very accurate. The very first digital cameras weren't good with this. People told us to shoot manual only. It worked in those days, but now the cameras are so good that you can, in most circumstances, trust your camera to do a good job. Okay, just as you can trust your cell phone to do a good job with taking exposure readings, you can trust your camera as well. It's sometimes based on the scene, might get it a little bit wrong, but you can see it and you can just dial up and down on exposure compensation. So you can brighten or darken an image, but these are the exceptions. These are, let's say, less than 5% of the time you might need to brighten or darken an image with exposure compensation. Most of the time your camera will get it right and it will do a very good job in exposing the scene correctly. So there are times when we shoot manual. Basically for me, the only time I would ever shoot manual is in controlled light conditions where I'm putting up lights. So let's say in a studio or on location where I'm using my own lights. Yes, I would shoot manual mode because that makes my editing easier. And because I've got full control on the lights on the scene, everything is then locked down and I can dial my lights up and down. My camera settings are locked down. And it is definitely a good way to work there. So the camera is not trying to adjust for the strobe lights. But in any other circumstances, street photography, things like cityscape, landscape, sports, all of these event photography. Anytime where things are changing, where lighting conditions are changing, the camera will adapt faster than what you can do. So if you turn around and you're facing a different direction and the light is changing, the camera will adapt instantly to that. It will take you a lot longer to dial settings up and down. So you paid for all these nice algorithms and things that they built into your camera for auto exposure. Trust it. You do have some control. You can set maximum ISO, you can set minimum shutter speed. So if you're worried about some of these settings, rather set the parameters within what the camera can operate. But yeah, you will miss less images or less critical moments if you trust your camera and you're using some of these more automated exposure modes. Shutter priority, aperture priority, program auto or program shift. They're really good modes and I think more people should be using them. Now, if you're trying to teach yourself a specific skill, if you're trying to teach yourself things about photography and exposure and how to control the different elements of exposure, by all means use manual. Set up a little still life scene, use manual controls on your camera, see what the differences are when you're changing the different things, how you need to compensate for different exposures. It's a good way of learning, but if you're just out and about taking photos, very often manual mode is not the mode you want to be in. So just remember that. The cameras these days are really good with doing exposure. So Yeah, then there's one little thing that I also commonly see when it comes to people using manual mode. They will be walking outside in the park. Let's say they'll be on a photo walk. The camera will be on full manual mode. They would point the camera at a scene, and the little light meter on the side or the light meter on the bottom in the viewfinder will tell them, oh, this scene is too dark by 2 stops. And they'll dial the ISO up to get it straight in the middle of what the light meter inside the camera is saying, and they'll click the button and say, I did a good job in manual. They might turn around and it's a brighter scene. Now the camera light meter is going the other way. It's telling them, oh, this scene is too bright. Now they maybe close the aperture a tiny bit and the light meter reading comes down and it's nicely on the little line in the middle. And they say, good, I used manual mode. All you're doing is you're trusting the exposure meter in the camera and the way it's calculating it. You could just as well have been in an automatic mode or in one of the priority modes. There's no difference. You're just adjusting your exposure to be on that little line. The camera can do that for you. The camera knows where that little line is. That's why it's showing you it's over or under. So don't think that it's better now just to dial dials up and down to match that little line when you could have been in either shutter priority, aperture priority, and the camera would just put that little line on the right spot in milliseconds where you still are trying to adjust dials. Yeah, so if you're doing things like event photography, even if it's just a family member's birthday, if it's a kid's birthday, anything like that, trust your auto modes. You'll miss less shots. Use your camera more like you would use your cell phone. Your cell phone camera, you just point and shoot. Set your camera to those modes as well, where you can just point and shoot and get results. If you want more control, use priority modes. If you really want a lot of control, like in studio situations, then go to manual. But don't think that you always have to be in a manual mode just because somebody told you to do it. Like I said, many years ago with the first digital cameras, a lot of these things were applicable, but they're not really applicable anymore. For a training scenario, it's different. If you want to teach yourself something, it's different, but not in everyday shooting, I think. Yeah, I think we should use our cameras more, and the more we can set them up like our cell phones, I think more people will be using them and getting better images. Okay, next, full frame. This is another one. So we've got this history with people saying full frame and full frame is the best and full frame is good. There's a couple of different opinions on this, and I just have to say, you don't need a full frame camera to enjoy your photography. It's the term full frame just comes from the sensor size being an approximate match for what a 35mm old film negative, the frame in a film camera would be the same size pretty much, almost. But that's just the size of a sensor. Our phones these days with tiny little sensors are doing good jobs of taking images. And I think for most people, most of the images in any given year that they take would be with a cell phone, with a tiny little sensor. So don't feel the need to always look at the latest and best camera. I think for the last 5 or 10 years, digital cameras have been really good. They've surpassed what we had with old film cameras in just optical quality of images. But yeah, I think there's a reason why a lot of people take out their phones, and we should look at that and say, why aren't we picking up the camera more? And some people also think, oh, but I don't have a full frame camera, I can't do a night shot. I don't have a full frame camera, I can't do a nice portrait. And I think that's not generally the case. There's definitely some advantages to full frame, and maybe with video work and some other work, people who need a full frame camera will know they need a full frame camera. It's really nice to have, but in some circumstances it will also work against you. So for instance, in event photography, I've had it very often where I take a micro four thirds or a crop sensor camera. Somebody else working at the same event doing photos would have a full frame camera, and just a simple thing like focusing would be easier for me because maybe it's low light conditions. Both cameras are on similar settings. So we've both gone to maybe a little bit of a higher ISO. We are shooting wide open on our lenses, similar lenses at the same shutter speed because we need to freeze the motion. And then a smaller sensor will actually give you more in focus at that same aperture. Okay? So you're getting the exact same amount of light in on the exact same settings, but on the smaller sensor, you're actually getting a little bit more in focus, which in a case like that with sport, with event photography, wildlife photography, it can actually be an advantage. So firstly, your lenses are a little bit smaller, cameras might be smaller, it's not always smaller, but you're getting the same amount of light with more in focus. Your depth of field is a little bit more. So that could be an advantage. Maybe if you're shooting outside portraits, then it goes the other way. You want to blur the background a little bit more. But I can tell you anything from pretty much micro four thirds or 1-inch compact sensors actually and up with a good lens, you can get plenty of nice background blur. So just as an example, this image, it's a micro four thirds image. You can see we're getting nice separation between the subject and the background. So yeah, don't think that you need a new camera. Don't think that you need the latest technology. I can promise you whatever camera you've got is probably plenty. And also, if you go back in history and you look at some of the award-winning photographs, Pulitzer Prize-winning photographs, 5 or 10 years ago, those digital cameras that the best photographers had, right now, the entry-level cameras are probably better and giving better image quality. So those guys won Pulitzer Prizes 5 or 10 years ago with specs that are a lot less than what we've got today. So don't always just jump on new technology. The trick is just to know your camera well and also to do more photography. That's generally where we need to go. Okay, so yeah, just as a comment on people saying that professional work you need full frame or these things. Definitely there's pros and cons to smaller and bigger sensors, and you need to make an informed choice when you're buying your gear, I think. But don't just think that bigger is always better. Sometimes it can work against you as well. Okay, next, number 4, high ISOs. So again, based on the history of digital photography, many of those early cameras were limited in ISO range, and also once you got to the higher end of whatever they could do, it became very noisy. So just as film with higher ISOs gets very grainy, digital sensors at extreme ISOs gets quite noisy. We know this, it's just the way they work, it's going to happen. But I think some people are so scared of high ISOs that they are missing images and they're getting blurry images because the shutter speeds are too slow. They're scared of raising the ISO. And I can tell you, doing event photography and things like this image right now on the screen, this was at a very, very high ISO for the camera I had there for this event. And I'm completely happy with this image. The client was completely happy with this image, and it was part of a whole set of images at an event. And you shouldn't be scared when you need to up the ISO. Now, obviously, if you don't need to up the ISO and you can keep it low, do that. Your image quality will be a little bit better. But I think a lot of photographers get stuck on noise and noise in low light conditions, and they're so scared to trust the camera and push up the ISO that they're actually not getting the images that they're happy with. So they're getting camera shake, they're getting blurred subjects because they're moving, and in the end they're just not happy with the images, where if they up the ISO, they would probably have been a lot happier. I also see a lot of people doing a lot of noise reduction in software and editing afterwards, and I think sometimes that also brings the quality of the image down quite a bit. So personally, I would do a tiny little bit of noise reduction on high ISO images and just make sure that my contrast and my clarity, sliders like that, I would rather use to enhance the image a tiny bit to make it look better, especially with things like sport photography, low light events, things like this where using high ISOs. Very often you can make the image look perfectly sharp and well exposed just by adding a little bit of contrast, a little bit of clarity, not too much, instead of going full on in with a lot of noise reduction. Okay. Most normal people will never notice a bit of digital noise in an image. I've never had a client comment on noise in an image, even when I had to use high ISOs. Some photographers will notice it. I might notice it when I look at my images, but I promise you, when you're sharing it with family, when you're sharing it with clients, most people will never notice the little bit of noise. So rather, under the circumstances where you need it, up the ISO and don't be scared to do that. Most cameras these days that I've tested, at the ISO below the max, they look still pretty good. I generally don't want to go to the highest ISO the camera can do, because some of the manufacturers are a little bit optimistic, and they might get quite noisy at the very highest ISO that your camera can do. But one setting below that should be still acceptable for image quality, and if you can get one below that, should be perfectly fine, and you won't have any issues. If you've got full control over the situation, if you're shooting in a studio, doing things like that, obviously lowest ISO or native ISO, you can go like 100 ISO or 200 ISO will give you very good results, but it's not always needed. Don't be scared of upping your ISO just because somebody told you you'll get a lot of noise. That's not really true with the modern cameras. They're really good at handling the noise. Okay, good. So rather freeze the action, rather up that ISO. Don't get blurry pictures. Blurry pictures are worse than a tiny bit of noise in the darker areas or whatever is going to happen. Especially if you're shooting sport and wildlife, you might have to crank up that ISO to freeze the action. And yeah, like I said, don't be scared. Next one, still with sensors and cameras and people thinking. Just as a thought, I think a lot of us are actually using our equipment as an excuse not to get out, not to do the work, not to take on the job for that next client. Very often, I think we use our equipment as an excuse, and we then just don't do the work that we actually could have done. We can do amazing work with older cameras. We can do amazing work with vintage cameras. So I think a lot of these myths are sort of also related to some excuses that we're telling ourselves. We might look at an image and say, oh, I'm not completely happy with this, and then blame our equipment. And in a lot of cases, it's not the equipment. We should just be shooting more. We should just be getting out more and using our equipment and really getting to know what they can actually do. Yeah. So sensor megapixels. This is another thing that for many years, especially the phone industry, but also the camera industry, promoted that more megapixels is better. The bigger megapixel camera you've got, the better it is. And definitely it was the case in early years of cameras in mobile phones and also just digital cameras overall. So it started off where digital cameras were actually worse than film cameras. So the quality you got out as an end result from a film camera was better than the first digital cameras. Okay? We had 1 megapixel cameras in phones, and in the first actual digital cameras we had 2 megapixel cameras, 4 megapixel cameras. So with these, every time it stepped up, it was a major improvement, and you could actually see that improvement. And that's why all the marketing teams jumped on this and said, oh, now we've got a 4 megapixel camera, now we've got a 5 megapixel camera, because it actually made a difference. But that was only in the very early years of digital photography. These days, I think pretty much most people would agree, once we went past about 12 megapixels, it really doesn't make that big a difference anymore. A lot of people, even when you print a photograph, let's say about half meter by 400 mil print, so 16 by or 20 by 16, 16 by 20, thereabouts. Most people won't see the difference between a 12 megapixel and a 20 megapixel image when you print it. The difference is so slight. Yeah, like I said, most people won't see the difference. So having gone past 12 megapixels, people are still promoting their products, and they're still saying, oh, it's got this many megapixels now. And I think there's other features that's more important in cameras. Things just like ergonomics. Where are the buttons? Does it feel comfortable to you? Do you like how the camera operates and works? I think these things are now more important than the megapixels that a camera has. Any modern camera in the last 5, even 10 years can do a good job. When you're working for print customers, magazines, newspapers, these sort of places, some of them will say 12 megapixels minimum. But generally, there won't be any other megapixel specs when you're submitting. If you want to print stuff, if you want to share stuff online, we're way past the megapixels that will really make a big difference. And you have to realize where you're going to be using these images when you're thinking about megapixels. So a lot of us might want to share our photo on Instagram. Okay, we're using maybe a 24 megapixel camera, or if we're using our phone, we're using a 12 megapixel camera. We're uploading it to Instagram, and Instagram is scaling it back to around about 1 megapixel. That's the quality you're getting on Instagram. So the Instagram photos very often are actually 0.7 megapixels. It depends a little bit on your aspect ratio and how it scales it. So if it's square 1080 by 1080, you get just more than 1 megapixel image. And people are looking at Instagram and saying, look at this amazing photo. So then the other thing that you need to keep in mind, some people will say, oh, but you need a lot of megapixels if you're going to be printing big images or large images to put on the wall, which is not always the case. Basically, the people that get to high megapixel sensors are better for printing. They look at the dots per inch and they'd say, oh, we want to print at 300 dpi. But pretty much even half that, most people won't see the difference, which is one thing. So you could probably print double as large as what people are saying for your sensor, and most people won't notice it. Then the other thing is, what people aren't, they're looking at dots per inch that your printer can do and then trying to fill that with what your camera outputs. But what they're not realizing is the larger a print generally, the further back somebody will stand looking at it. So if you've got a tiny little image that's a jumbo sized or postcard sized image, you would hold it pretty close when you're looking at it. If you've got a 2-meter print on your wall, you can't be right up against it. You can't see the whole image. You'll generally be a couple of meters back so that you can actually see the complete image. Okay. If you're looking at a billboard, you might be 20 or 30 meters away. So billboards, they print at resolution sometimes as low as 2 dots per inch. Very often billboards are printed between 2 or 20 dots per inch. So that's big dots on the billboard, but nobody's up against the billboard, you're driving past. So viewing distance is something that you need to keep in mind. When you're looking at your phone, it might be closer, it's a smaller screen. When you're looking at your television set, it might be the other side of a room and it's a larger screen. So generally, as images get bigger, we tend to move back to actually enjoy the image. So very often, if you can print an A4 image and it looks fine, you could probably scale it up to a larger image and it will still look fine. It's only once you get up close to it, you'll see the dots. But really, it might be a photographer that does that, but most normal people will stand back when it's a large image. Okay, so you can print pretty large images even from 12 megapixels. Okay. Then just one little thing, there's one tiny little exception when I'm saying don't worry about megapixels these days, and that's just if you're going to crop heavily, and you can think about this, if you're going to throw away a lot of your image, if you're just going to crop down and use a tiny part of your image, obviously it's nice to have more megapixels because the end result might be your 12 or 20 megapixels if you're starting with a 30 or whatever size it is. So if you're doing sport or wildlife and you know you're going to be cropping heavily, you might benefit from more megapixels. The only thing to remember is there's a trade-off. Most modern sensors in the exact same size, so let's say a full frame sensor, if it's two modern full frame sensors, the one is, let's say, 24 megapixels, the other one is 40 megapixels. The 40 means they've squeezed these pixels closer together, and very often, especially in low light, you'll get more noise. Okay? A bigger actual pixel or sensor size will react better in low light if it's like from the same year or similar cameras. If it's too modern sensors, very old sensors will be quite noisy and different, so we excluding that. But let's say you comparing two cameras in the store today that you can buy. The one is double the megapixels of the other one. Generally, the one with the more megapixels will be a bit more noisy in low light conditions. So just remember that the actual larger pixel in the same size sensor will respond better to low light in general. And you can see this in ranges like Sony, where they actually produce a version of their A7 specifically for low light that's got lower megapixels. The video guys use this very often. So just remember, if you're going for megapixels, it might also mean a bit more noise. So megapixels, yeah, my personal opinion is once you go above 12, it's very hard to see the difference, and you're probably fine. So again, we shouldn't be using our gear as an excuse. Okay. Then I've got one last little tiny bonus tip just to finish off on all our myths and misconceptions. I think a lot of people are also always, they're thinking that they're looking at other images and they're saying, oh, there's nothing as interesting close to me. I can't take images like this of the beach. I can't take images like this, beautiful images, travel images, because there's nothing like that close to me. And very often it becomes an excuse. Like our gear very often becomes an excuse. It's the same for me. A lot of these myths and misconceptions I believed for a very long time, and I had to think about these things and get myself to not believe them. So it just becomes another excuse not to take my camera out. It just becomes another excuse not to be taking photos and improving my own photography. This image, let me show it again. So this image here, I took on the street corner closest to my house, literally on the block where my house is. So there's really no excuse, and I quite like this image, by the way. So I like street photography, and I always think, oh, the guys in Paris or New York have got such a good time. They can do all this street photography. I think we've got amazing street photography right here in Johannesburg. And when somebody travels to Johannesburg, some other street photographer from Paris or New York, they take amazing images right here. They could take amazing images down the street from me, but I use it as an excuse. So I think we need to realize that some of these myths and things we're using as an excuse for why we're not doing better work or why we're not doing more work. And we really should stop doing that. We can take amazing images with whatever gear we've got, and we can do it right where we are. There's always something interesting happening. You could do nice still lifes inside your house if you want to play around with camera settings. You could go to the garden and do some macro photography, play around with some settings. You could walk around the block and do some street photography. I think, and you could do it with your phone, you could do it with your camera. Just doing it and getting out and training your eye and looking at what the settings are doing, you'll become a better photographer with whatever kit you've got and wherever you are. I think we shouldn't be using these things as excuses. So the travel thing, I often hear that, and very often I see an image and I think, oh, this guy's so lucky he's in that spot, and not always true. We should be doing more photography in our backyards, I think. So that's the last one, a little bonus one. Should we always be traveling to interesting places? I say, well, you don't have to. And the same as with the gear. Sometimes saving up and doing research and getting that new lens is exciting, and it inspires us to take more photos. Sometimes having a trip to a nice spot or doing a photo walk or something will inspire us to get back into photography and take more images. And I think then it's useful. If you can use these things like gear or travel or whatever it is as motivation, it's great. But I do think sometimes we rely on that motivation too much. And I think it's not an excuse. Even when we don't have new gear and even when we can't travel, we can still make amazing photos. So yeah, that's my 5 myths of digital photography. I'm glad you joined. And then, is there anybody who's got any questions? Or if you just want to say something about any of these myths, I'm happy to discuss that with you. Anything that resonated or that made you think, or something that you actually believed in there, I'd be happy to have a quick chat about anything that you realized in this presentation. We've got like 4 minutes left, 5 minutes left before I'm going to end it. So yeah, any thoughts on that? Any other things that you think some photographers believe or tell you that you don't think is absolutely correct? Or things that you think changed over the years with digital photography? Yeah, gear acquisition syndrome. Roger, you are correct. And don't get me wrong, I like my camera. I've got more than one. I've got some old film cameras I still use back there. I like them as well. But in the end, they're tools. They shouldn't be excuses, point one. And two, they're just tools to get a job done. I like good tools. I like good quality tools. I like tools that make my life easier. I like understanding my tools. But I can tell you, if I use a camera for a couple of years, I still find things that helps me with my photography in the hidden somewhere in a menu. It takes me a good few years to really know a camera to the point where I can adjust settings quickly and not even look at the screen and adjust things on the thing. I could be talking to a model or something and adjust something, and then just pick up the camera and take a photo. And it takes time to get used to your camera. If you're replacing it too often, I think you miss out on really getting to know the tool as well as you should. So sometimes I also like, even if I replace my professional camera that I use for work every day, I like taking the one that I'm taking out of circulation, using that for street photography, because I know that camera so well, and with street things can happen quickly. So that the one that I'm sort of retiring from professional work is very often the one I like most for doing street photography. Yeah. The lazy worker blames his tools. I agree, Oscar. I like what's coming out. So yeah, I was guilty of this as well. I would look at a photo and say, man, if I had that other lens, this would be better. Or I would look at it and say, man, if I had that other camera, I could have done a better job here. And it took me to realize that I can take really nice photos with my cell phone, to think critically about my photography kit and say, yeah, if my cell phone can do it, what about a nice digital camera with a nice lens on it? And I mean, nice, anything in the last 10 years should be nice. I should be able to get a so much better image with my camera and lens, whatever I've got, than what my cell phone can do. If I'm looking at the specs, even if I've got an old camera and an old vintage lens, I should still be able to do better than what my cell phone does. But why am I very often super happy with what my cell phone does, and I'm trying to make excuses for my digital camera kit and gear? Took me a while to realize that. I started doing professional work with a Nikon DSLR, and it took me a while to realize that I could use a small micro four thirds sensor camera and still deliver the same quality work to a client and still be happy with it. The kit wasn't everything. There were some other conveniences around smaller kits and things that I liked. Yes. Next one. Thanks so much. Not feeling guilty to be on JPEG. You shouldn't be. JPEG is amazing. I'm seriously considering switching back to JPEG for professional work. Like I said, for over 10 years, I've only used RAW for professional work. And this week I did my first completely JPEG shoot for a client, and I was super surprised, and it took me minutes to edit versus hours to edit. So I needed to make sure I got the settings right and white balance right and all sorts of things, but I'm very happy experimenting with JPEG a bit more. So I think I'll be shooting a lot more JPEG in future. Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed this session, Sonia. Good. Great. I'm happy everybody's happy. If there's any more questions, you can just pop them in the chat. If not, we're probably going to end this in a couple of seconds. Great discussion here at the end. I'm glad to see the comments. Good. Thanks, Roger. Thanks for joining. Happy to see you. Glad the load shedding is finished. Good. Then I think we'll call it an evening, and I'll see you for the next one. Have a good evening, everybody.